here and I kind of feel like I might be doing a press conference or something. You got all the mics, you got the boomer zoomers right here on front row. It's just pretty intimidating, but it's great to be back with y'all. Last Sundays we were looking at the life of Joseph. And again, each week we want to look at Joseph's life, not just historically, but through the lens of Scripture as a type of Christ. But as we were looking last week, if chapter 40 had ended with verse 42, we would have thought Joseph ended in a pretty good spot. Remember in our study last week, it was Pharaoh's birthday. Pharaoh called all of his servants together for a big party, but he also brought the cupbearer and the baker to be re-examined. Well, they'd been in prison with Joseph. They were in prison with him because they'd been charged with a capital offense. They've been charged with a criminal offense of crime against the state. But Joseph, being used of God, was able to interpret the disturbing dreams that these two men had. Two different men, two different dreams, but one real unified outcome. And that was simply this: both men were going to be lifted back up. Their heads would be brought back up before Pharaoh. Both would be tried again. The cupbearer would be exonerated. The baker executed. Well, that was important because we know as the chapter came to an end, exactly what Joseph said would happen came to pass. He gave the interpretation of their dreams in great clarity, great detail, and that was necessary too because this was God proving to others that Joseph was now in the role of being able to speak as a prophet. What he said would literally come to pass according to the very minutest detail. Well, the chapter ends with Joseph saying to the cupbearer, hey, remember me when you get out of here. Just put in a word because I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and I'm in here without being guilty. That's all he simply asked. And we talked about that. We talked about the fact that Joseph did this, I believe, as an act of faith, not trying to manipulate his circumstances. I believe he'd been looking for God to fulfill his dreams for some time. Because remember, Joseph's no longer 17. By the time he's interacting with the cupbearer and the baker, he's probably 27, maybe more likely 28 years of age. And he is trusting that God is still going to make the dreams that God gave him all those years ago come completely true. So he puts in a word through the cupbearer, but with those hopes maybe held high, we see the chapter 40 end with these words, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. Well, that's kind of a sad way to end a chapter, and it's even more disturbing, I think, when you look at the opening 4 words of chapter 41. Listen to what these words say: after 2 whole years. All right, Jim, why are you going to stop? You know this is a long chapter, don't you? We got a lot of ground to cover today. Why are you stopping with 4 words? It's because they're really important. We might say, hey, 2 years ago, but we might really mean 16 months, 18 months, 20 months, whatever. I've got a granddaughter who's 2 years old. Well, not quite. She's 20, almost 21 months old. But this literally in Hebrew says, after 2 whole years of days. So the cupbearer goes out and Joseph has high hopes. But day after day gives way to week after week and month after month until 730 days pass. And actually, on this morning when Joseph got up, it was just the same. Lord, I wait. I wait for you. He didn't know that this was the day that God was going to be doing something miraculous in his life. But God knew. So after these 2 whole years, literally again, 2 years of days of waiting and not knowing, that's hard for us, isn't it? When we're stuck in those hard situations and you're trying to discern, God, what are you doing? I thought I understood. We can identify with this, can't we? I remember not very long ago, maybe 6-7 years ago or so, there was a situation in our lives where God had, I felt, made something really clear to us that he was about to do in our lives. And I was all in. I was prepared to do whatever it was, every detail of what he was asking. And then he brought me right up to the trigger point and he changed the plan. Oh, that's how I saw it. He didn't change his plan at all. His plan was still constant. But it was frustrating to me. So I can identify with Joseph at this moment. He thought 2 years ago, God was maybe going to start to, let him go, get out of prison at least, if not elevate him. But now we see what God's plan had been all along. So after these 2 years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. Verse 3, and behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. Again, Joseph has already had his 2 dreams. Cupbearer and the baker have had their 2 dreams. We've already understood that they tend to dream in context of their reality. Well, here we see Pharaoh, likewise, having dreams that are very Egyptian in nature. What is he doing? But he is the ruler, the king of Egypt, is standing by the Nile. Well, the Nile was believed to be one of the gods that they worshiped. Pharaoh himself was a god. That's what they said. He was the god Ra in flesh. But the Nile was Hapi, H-A-P-I, the god of prosperity. So here he is, he's standing in his dream by the Nile, and out comes from the Nile all these prize-winning, first place prize-winning cattle out of the Nile. Well, that sounds a little out of the ordinary to me. I don't expect, I see cattle in the field, but not coming out of a river. But this was actually in context. Cattle in that day would actually wade down chest deep into the water of the Nile as a way to keep the heat off of them, the flies off of them. Only thing they had to worry about was an occasional crocodile. But other than that, it was a good dynamic for them. But as he sees in his dream these cows coming up, he realizes these are incredible cows. They're the best he's seen. But then the dream turned very, very disturbing to him, because suddenly 7 more cows stepped up out of the Nile, and they were the sickliest, scraggliest, don't even waste time slaughtering them type of beast that you could ever see. And here they come up out of the Nile, they have the nerve to stand right by the prize winners. In verse 4, then the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Now that's the master of understatement right there. You see a dream like that, you've had those dreams that just wake you up and they startle you. Well, he's had this disturbing dream and he's startled in the middle of the night. Finally, though, in verse 5, he falls back asleep and he dreams a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears, and Pharaoh awoke. And behold, it was a dream. So again, we've got 2 dreams in one night. You know, Pastor's starting Zechariah. We've just got started on that on Sunday nights. We're going to start tonight into the first of 8 dreams that Zechariah has in one night. It didn't take more than 2 dreams for Pharaoh to realize. Remember, the Egyptian culture believed the gods communicated through them or to them through dreams. So he's now in a predicament. He has these 2 dreams. He's awakened and he's very disturbed. He needs to know, what do these dreams mean? So what does he do? But he calls out for all of his magi, for all of those who were skilled in interpreting dreams. Remember, that was one of the professions in the Egyptian culture of the day. So verse 9, in the morning, his spirit being troubled, he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Well, that's a very similar predicament, isn't it? We just saw in chapter 40, verse 8, that the cupbearer and the baker, they had dreams, but they were in a predicament because no one was in the prison, or so they thought, who could tell them what did the dreams actually mean. What was the future that was being predicted? So Pharaoh, having all the power that he would have as the head of state at his disposal, brings in the best of the best, all of the magi and all of the wise men. He tells them his dream, and they can't give him an answer. So he's in the exact same predicament that the cupbearer faced just 2 years before. Well, in verse 9, kind of an interesting statement. It says, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. We might think, how convenient, better late than never. But I think it's important for us when we look back, even at something now, we're trying to track with this passage as if we're Joseph in real time. However, we can't completely separate ourselves from the reality. We're a couple thousand years later, and we've got the rest of the story. We can look back at this, and we can look at this and said, when he remembers his offenses, we know that God is free to work however he wills, through his people as well as the pagans. Think of the 2 years, day after day. Joseph is just another day in prison. But God was working. Timing was now perfect. In fact, the timing was God's. Because now God stirs the cupbearer that he remembers what he'd done. What he had done to Pharaoh, or been accused of doing to Pharaoh, that Pharaoh had been angry with him, that he'd been imprisoned. Listen to what he continues to say in verse 10. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, remember that's Potiphar, the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. Verse 13, and as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Now we see the importance of the detail that Joseph gave in both interpreting both of those dreams. Now we know that the cupbearer can point to the exact playing out of the interpretation because he'd been an eyewitness to both. He heard Joseph as he interpreted the baker's dream, and he saw it come true. He heard Joseph when Joseph spoke to him, and he saw it come true. Now, he doesn't mention even now to Pharaoh anything that Joseph had asked him to mention. Hey, just put in a word, that I was stolen out of my own land, that I was put in prison wrongly so. He simply tells him, hey, I know somebody who can help. He's a Hebrew. He's a servant, a slave, but he can help. Well, Pharaoh likes what he hears because in verse 14, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and quickly they brought him up out of the pit. And when he shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Do you get the sense of urgency that Moses communicates in that verse? They sent, they called, they summoned, and quickly, boom, boom, boom. I got to have an answer. Pharaoh's got to know now. What was the dream about? He's very perplexed. This is something about the future, and I don't understand it. Get him. If he can interpret dreams, get him here to me. Well, if he's in a hurry to get Joseph, does it seem a little bit contradictory, maybe, on the surface, that Joseph takes time to shave and clean up and change clothes? Well, some of you all shaking your heads no, and I'm glad because it isn't. What is important for us to know is this is a cultural concession. You see, to a Hebrew, a beard was a sign of dignity. To an Egyptian, it was an insult. Even the pharaohs themselves were always clean shaven. The only time they had a beard, they put on a beard that they attached to themselves made out of metal when they were making high-level ruling decisions. Even the female pharaohs would put that same fake beard on just for making the rulings. Then they would take it off. So Joseph simply is making himself, keeping himself from becoming an accidental or unnecessary offense. Okay, I can't help but occasionally jump ahead. We're going to jump ahead in the application. How many times have we been in positions to share a kind word, the gospel truth, but we don't do it in a way that we are culturally sensitive to the day? So when we share, we tend to become an offense just in and of ourselves. See, the gospel itself is an offensive thing. It will necessarily confront people in their sin, but that's not for us to champion the offense. We're to present the truth in love. We're to do it in a way that it's palatable, that it's receivable, so that the Holy Spirit might use it. But being careful ourselves to be aware that we don't become the offense just because of our own prickly personality or some preconceived notion. Another way to put it might be is we live in Birmingham, Alabama in 2022. Let's speak that language, even as we share the gospel this week. Speak into the culture of our day without being an unnecessary offense. The gospel will offend, but let's not. So as he comes, he's prepared. He's not going to be an offense. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Well, that's interesting because what he just said is, Joseph, your reputation has preceded you. I've heard great things about you. I'm confident in you right now. That's why I sent for you. So how does Joseph respond? Look at the very next verse. After he's just been applauded by Pharaoh, Joseph, verse 16, answers him saying, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. See, here's where Joseph's character comes shining through. Joseph will not take upon himself glory that belongs to God alone. It's not in him. It's not him that is interpreting the dreams. It is God using him. We saw him as a dreamer. Now we've seen him as someone who has discernment, who can interpret dreams, but he's not relying on himself. He's relying on God alone. To put it in the paraphrased words of John Calvin, all abilities and gifts that God gives us appear all the greater when they're used humbly, not to heap praise upon ourselves, but to give all glory rightfully to God. And I think Joseph's character shines here strongly because he doesn't take the praise. He actually has the confidence and the boldness to disabuse Pharaoh of his wrong thinking. It's not up to men to tell you what dreams mean. That's from God. But he's got an open audience because they believe the gods tell what dreams mean. He just doesn't yet know the one true God. So after that, Pharaoh continues, verse 17, he's not dissuaded by Joseph's mild redirecting of his thinking. Verse 17, Pharaoh then says to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile, and they fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. So we're hearing the second telling of the dream. We get just this one little snippet of extra information right there. He's never seen anything this bad in his life. Verse 20, and the thin, ugly cows, they ate up the first 7 plump cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. So again, another snippet of information. Why is he so disturbed? This doesn't make no sense to him logically. It's making no sense at all. Now he continues, verse 22, I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So now Joseph knows not only the dreams, but he knows the predicament. Pharaoh is exasperated. He wants to know, what do these dreams mean? But no one's been able to help him to date. Joseph now, having been equipped, is going to begin tell Pharaoh exactly what they mean. Then Joseph, verse 25, I believe, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. So he makes it clear. You just had 2 iterations of the same dream. I've done that, haven't you? You have a dream, it wakes you up, you go back to sleep, you go, oh, that was just a dream. And if you don't, just pick it up right where you left off. And you get the dream and it just continues. You get the next chapter out of the dream. Well, that's exactly what Pharaoh has experienced. It's one dream, same basic overall interpretation. So he starts to unpack the dreams. Verse 27, the 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt. But after them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. Verse 32, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now we are seeing Joseph. Here he is, he's able to use knowledge and discernment to tell Pharaoh what the dreams mean. He's able to unpack with knowledge and discernment exactly what's going to take place. But he's also going to move beyond that, because now he's going to offer wisdom in just a moment that tells Pharaoh what to do. He doesn't simply make the problem clear. He makes a solution. He proposes a solution that God has given him so that Pharaoh would know. But Pharaoh, again, now at least knows the details. Did you notice 3 times in just this short paragraph? God has revealed, verse 25, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Verse 28, God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. And then verse 32, God will shortly bring it to pass. The purpose of the 2 dreams was to show that this was certain. This was not maybe, sort of, kind of. Again, Joseph, as he interprets the dreams, is very particular. He doesn't give broad generalities. He says, no, those 7 great looking years, those 7 incredible cows, we're going to have great 7 years ahead of us as a nation. It's going to be the most bountiful harvest you've ever seen. However, those 7 blighted years and those 7 scraggly old cows that ate up the other ones. By the way, anybody think Chick-fil-A here? You eat more chicken? Come on, where's Chick-fil-A? It must have been a Sunday. They weren't around. But at any rate, they ate them up. He's saying this is simply, it's because the famine is going to be so incredibly severe, you're going to forget the bountiful harvest. Well, this was something Egypt actually had practice in. They'd gone through famines before. Famines so severe that they actually cannibalized each other just to live. This was not new to their culture, but Joseph is saying this is going to be more severe than you can imagine. So what does he say next? He moves beyond just knowledge and discernment. He exercises wisdom to provide a cure. He continues to unpack this before Pharaoh, and he says to him, beginning in verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather food for those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Joseph offers a solution, but he doesn't highlight himself still. He's not saying, hey, I think I can handle this for you. He's simply saying, this is what you need to do. You need to get a man, put one person in charge, someone who you can trust, and then he needs to use other men to help get the job done. And you need to go throughout all the land, and under the name of Pharaoh, in other words, under your authority, O king, under your authority, all of this tax money that we're going to collect, 20% tax, 20% of the grain is going to go into the silos. Now, the way this would work would simply be, we living here in Birmingham, we would have silos in Hoover and in Birmingham and in Pelham, and our grain would go into our silo. Well, during the 7 years of plenty, that might seem ridiculous. Why are you taxing us 1/5 of everything we grow? In the 7 years of famine, we're going to be so thankful that it's right there where we know where it was put. So he walks Pharaoh through, tells him the plan, unfolds even how to carry out the plan, but again, without once thinking of himself. Notice what God does there. Verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? I believe he's looking at every one of his wise men who couldn't do a thing for him. He's looking at every one of the magicians. And then I believe in my mind, so I see him beeline looking right at Joseph. Is there anyone else in this room as capable as this man? He did what you couldn't. His God did what our gods couldn't. And he looks at him and goes, this man has the Spirit of God on him. Well, that's quite an acknowledgement by even a pagan king, to recognize that the one true living God, though he may not embrace him, is the one behind this man having all of this wisdom, all of this insight, and all of this capability as a leader. So then Pharaoh, verse 39, continues and said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning as wise as you are. 40, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. 3rd time's a charm. We saw this happen when he was in Potiphar's house. We saw this happen again when he was in Potiphar's prison. Now we're seeing it happen with the entire nation of Egypt. Here's Joseph, a proven and capable leader. Why? Because he's submitted to the will of God. He's trusting that God's at work. Oh, he doesn't understand how, when, where, what he's going to really do, but he's believing the two dreams he had 13 years earlier. And he's believing they are certainly going to come to pass. So he's trusting God, and God is using him. God is giving him the wisdom he needs. God, using his spirit, is guiding Joseph every step of the way. Remember, a couple chapters ago, we were told 3 times in that chapter that Joseph was aware that God was with him, and he was making everything that Joseph did prosper. Now we see it finally come to pass. Well, I have to pause here and give you one quick type of Christ. See, before Christ was exalted, he suffered humiliation. And he suffered persecution, just as Joseph models for us as the shadow. He's the shadow pointing ahead to the fulfillment in Christ. Joseph, who had everything, just as Jesus had everything in heaven with his father, left his father, lost everything, humanly speaking. Joseph is imprisoned. He suffers. He's humiliated. Now it leads to exaltation. Philippians 2. That at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, every tongue confess that he is Lord. See, before God exalts, he puts us through the testing and trials of suffering and humiliation. This is a great illustration for us because God is always at work in our lives the same way. You realize that what you're going through right now might simply be another part of God preparing you in private right now for something else he wants to do through you in a future date. See, God always prepares us in private, equips us in private for what we're about to walk through in public, but he does it before we walk through it. So Joseph now has been exalted. He has been lifted up. He is now second only to Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh said, verse 41 to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand. You know the kind, the one that you seal things with. It says, you've got the authority. He took the signet ring from his hand and he put it on Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen. The royal robe has returned. Remember, the multicolored robe meant a long-sleeved robe, a robe of royalty. Now he is restored to a robe of royalty. And he put a gold chain about his neck. This is not bling like you see the NFL players still wearing as they're getting their heads knocked off by each other. Remember the pictures of pharaohs? This was a gold collar about this tall. It'd be around the neck because why? You are somebody. You have the gold. You make the rules. This was a sign of authority that Pharaoh was giving to Joseph, a Hebrew, by the way. And he made him ride in his second chariot. He didn't get Air Force One, but he did get Air Force Two, and it was okay. He made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." And then he sent him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh." Don't miss the authority that I'm giving you. "I am Pharaoh. Without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt." So he's got absolute authority, free reign to do whatever it is he wants to do because Pharaoh trusts him. He's able to answer Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh believes his dreams are going to come true, just as this man Joseph has said. So he enables him, he empowers him. He even says, go before him and cry out, bow the knee. Literally, kiss the ground he walks on. Pay homage to him. So they send him out, verse 45, but before that, Pharaoh changes Joseph's name. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. Now, if I'd said at the beginning of this quarter, we're going to study the life of Zaphanath-Paneah as a type of Christ, y'all would have all checked out another class, right? I wouldn't have stuck around for that. But he got a new name. And commentators kind of disagree about what does the name mean, but most likely it meant something about interpreter of dreams or savior of the world, because they realized his ability to interpret the dreams is what was going to keep the nation alive. Changes his name, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Now, I talked just briefly about the name, but there's one more reason he gets this name. Remember, Joseph looks Egyptian. He's been there now 13 years. He sounds Egyptian. He's gained a lot of the customs and the cultures and the mannerisms, but a Hebrew name would not be accepted as a ruler over Egypt. So what does Pharaoh do? He gives him an Egyptian name, complete buy-in to the Egyptian culture. So when they hear Joseph, they don't hear Joseph, they hear Zaphanath-Paneah. Zaphanath-Paneah, on behalf of Pharaoh, goes throughout the entire land, and he has a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, not daughter of Potiphar. Commentators love to get off on this one too. Did he actually marry Potiphar's daughter? And I don't think so. That would make Potiphar's wife his mother-in-law. That's not going to play out really well. But at any rate, he now has the absolute authority and power over the entire nation and all the credentials that go with it. So Joseph went out. In verse 46, we finally get a clarifying of the timetable, where we're told Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and he went through all the land of Egypt. Verse 47, during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt. He put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Drop down with me now to verse 53. 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. Verse 55, but when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up the storehouses and he sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land. Moreover, verse 57, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the land. So what we have just seen is more than 7 years past in just a handful of verses. Just a blip on the screen, we've got the 7 years of feast. Joseph does exactly what he interpreted Pharaoh's dream to be, the wisdom that should take place. All of the 20% of the grain every year after year, 3rd year, 4th year, 6th year, 7th year, all is in the storehouses. And it's all right there nearby where the people around the fields surrounding, where the people could see it. Now the famine hit. And the famine has already become so severe, so we're probably a full year at least, maybe into the 2nd year of the famine, when the Egyptians are crying out, give us something to eat. We have nothing. And Pharaoh simply says, whatever Joseph, Zaphanath-Paneah, tells you to do, you do it. Well, Jim, why did you jump over verse 50 to 52? Because I wanted to look at it right now. To me, these two verses are a bit of a parenthetical, and let's read them. Before the year of famine came, so this is sometime between Joseph being 30 and Joseph being 37, because that's when the famine starts. Before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Again, looking at Joseph's character, he has 2 sons in 7 years by one woman. Not like his forefathers who had multiple wives. He has 2 sons by one woman who is a pagan, an Egyptian, and he's a Jew. And his 2 sons, when they are born, are not given Egyptian names. They're not Zaphanath-Paneah the 3rd and 4th. They're simply Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh meaning God made me forget all the trials and the tribulations and the struggles of my past. So Joseph now has realized, this is my dream coming true. God has set me here to rule over Egypt. I'm putting behind all of those awful memories I had of my brothers. And also, Ephraim, God has made me fruitful. He's given me blessing. He's given me progeny. He's given me sons. But we know there's so much more to this, because here's the beauty of this for us. When we look at the type of Christ in Joseph, here we see the Gentiles being grafted in. They're God's people. Manasseh and Ephraim become 2 of the 12 tribes. They are God's people, and so are we. God's people are all the redeemed of all the ages that he has brought back because his son was sent. His son was the one at the Mount of Transfiguration of whom it said, whatever he says, you do, just like Joseph was told. So Joseph as the type of Christ, Christ is the antitype to the type. We can see so clearly what God is doing. One last thing I just want to each week draw us to, and that is, what are we to do with this? We don't want to just gain information or even insight as to how Joseph was a type of Christ. What difference does this make? I love what Pastor has said many times. He says this: our circumstances don't reveal our character. They don't determine our character. They simply reveal it. And it's important that when we're facing the challenges, the trials, that we remember God is on his throne. He's constant. I will trust him. No matter what's going on in my life today, tomorrow, next year, next month, whatever, I will trust him. Though the circumstances have changed, they didn't change my character. And that's simply very important for us because the situations we faced, I was years ago able to speak, my daughter, who now is 32, I got to speak at her high school graduation. And I challenged that class of 18-year-olds. You're about to reveal who you've been becoming all along. Well, that's still true for us. What we walk through today is simply God's way to reveal, sometimes even to us, who he's been making us to be all along. Will we trust him? Will we rest confident in him? Will we remain faithful to him? Will our character be refined as though put into a fiery furnace and come forth as gold? Not many of us like to wait. I don't think any of us really like suffering. Many of us would love to sign up for the exaltation piece, but you only get there by step one and step two. I want to encourage you, and I want you to encourage me. We have to come alongside each other and say, what you're going through, I've got you. I'm with you. I'm beside you. I'm upholding you in prayer, and I'll do anything physically that I can do to come to your aid. But remember, what you're going through is part of the plan. It's part of his purpose, even though it may not be ours. Father, please help us, because that's difficult. We can say the words so much easier than we can live them. But we do know that you are working, and you are faithful, and you never change. So the very truths that we're learning from the life of Joseph are the truths that we need today. Increase our faith and our belief in you, our confidence in you. Let us look away from our own abilities or what we think we're able to figure out and sort through on our own. Let us trust you. And Lord, as we trust you, even in suffering and in humiliation, let us exalt your holy name, because that's where the glory belongs. Go before us throughout the rest of this day. Keep us safe. Let us live to your glory alone. In Jesus' name, amen.